I just don't get that level of hypocrisy and how they can get away with this. What are your thoughts on that?
You're asking me to think like a Republican, and
Yeah.
I don't quite know how to do that.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer on my Conversations with Frank Schaeffer series on a podcast and on Facebook Live, YouTube, and many other places. I'm with someone that I have a great deal of respect for, Representative Ted Lieu. And I first met him a number of years ago when I did an interview with him starting a group called Vote Common Good that then went on a 50 state or so bus tour, or maybe it was 35 states in 2018, trying to get Democrats elected. And then, of course, more activity in the recent election. So, Representative Lieu, I have a question for you, first of all, and that is, most recently, I guess the tweet that I saw of yours was daring the Roman Catholic bishops to deny communion to you. As someone who comes from an evangelical background that I left and was in a family that had a lot to do with the formation of the religious right in the 1970s and 80s, of course, you got my attention. So can you talk a little bit about that and the juxtaposition of your own Roman Catholic background?
Yeah. Thank you, Frank, for that question. First of all, great to see you again. And let me, first of all, thank you and Vote Common Good for helping us flip the House in 2018 and then helping us hold the House last term. The issue you talk about had to do with, it looked like a decision by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to produce a document that would start the Catholic Church in the U.S. down the road of denying communion to Catholics. And my view is that was completely backwards, because the body and blood of Christ should not be restricted from Catholics. It should be expanded. You want to share God's love. You want to invite everyone to the table. You don't want to be an exclusive club where you've got Catholic bishops deciding who gets to sit at the table, who doesn't. It's very clear to me that they were embarking down the wrong path. And I'm very glad that the Conference of Catholic Bishops, in fact, later clarified and said they're not going to do that. They're not going to issue a document that's going to basically deny communion to Catholics.
It seems to me, coming from my religious right background, you know, my dad, Francis Schaeffer, was an evangelist. In the 1970s and 80s, we knew people like Ronald Reagan and the Bush family. I used to stay with Jack Kemp when I was in Washington. He and his wife, Joanne, would put me up, and my father wound up borrowing Jerry Falwell's jet flying around the country. And essentially, our family was instrumental in the formation of the evangelical wing of the anti-abortion movement. I left all that in the late 1980s and have since become a political activist on a more progressive side. So that's my background. And of course, coming from that background, when I look at you as a practicing Roman Catholic and this issue with the bishops, it just seems to me that with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court and the use of religious liberty lingo to strip other Americans of their civil rights, whether it's the gay community or the trans community and others, that you and I, as religious people with religious backgrounds, should have a special sensitivity to the fact that there are a lot of right-wingers on the Republican side who seem to be bent on using the Supreme Court and other means to, in essence, bring us towards a theocracy more like Iran or Saudi Arabia in some ways than what we think of as America. Do you have any thoughts on that?
We do, unfortunately, see the radical right and their radicalization of Republicans, where they're trying to maintain control through anti-democratic means, whether it's through voter suppression or through their Supreme Court, where you had a number of Republican senators block Merrick Garland, even though he was appropriately nominated by President Obama. You do see these tactics being used by Republicans to try to maintain control in a country where they are not the majority. They are the minority, and with every passing year, they become even smaller, and they are now using desperate means to try to cling to power.
How do you see all this playing out in the short, long term and then the longer term?
So I'm very disturbed by the voter suppression efforts by the Republican state legislatures in a number of states. At the same time, I want people to understand that even though these laws are bad, they're not like the Jim Crow laws, which would literally stop you from voting. So if you couldn't count the number of jelly beans in a jelly bean jar, you just couldn't vote. If you're registered to vote, you can vote next year. And I hope everyone goes out and votes, and that they're angry and that there's a backlash about Republicans who are trying to suppress their vote. We need to educate voters how to overcome some of these obstacles that these Republican legislators have put in their place. But if you're registered to vote, you absolutely can vote. And I hope you do next year.
Yeah, coming from my background, I think if I tried to sum up what we were doing in the 1970s and what I think the religious right is still doing today, and a lot of the Trump voters and so forth, people like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham and others, all of whom I knew personally and who got into politics largely because of the work of my father, by the way, sadly, that we could say that we were selling fake family values. And what I mean by that is that whether it was on the issue of abortion or chastity or any of these other things, with no social programs, no safety net, no effort to help people on an individual basis, our concern for human life ended at birth. And that if we were going to have a culture that had real family values, we could say something like this in a discussion on abortion. Okay, let's look at Roe v. Wade again. Maybe it was badly decided. But before we do that, we're going to have to change some things. And for instance, there should be no barrier to our careers when we leave work, care for our children, and then return to work. And this ought to be done legislatively. Care for preschool-age children would be top-notch, child-centered and free, rooted in hands-on experience of nature, creative play, conversational skills, and so forth. Teens and other young parents, single or pair bonded, would get total support to continue educations in their lives, suffer no downside if they found themselves pregnant. What do you think about a legislative agenda? What's the practicality of a legislative agenda as we go forward in the best of all worlds to really begin to give America and American women and men and transgender folks and non-binary people actual choices when it comes to family, to pair bonding, to love, to childcare, and these other things? So we could have a real discussion rather than just saying, here's your choice and it's a bad choice.
That's a great question. I'm very pleased that we passed American Rescue Plan. It was a transformative law that got shots into arms, people back into work, cash into pockets. And at the same time, it had the child tax credit, which was a monumental piece of legislation. It's going to lift half of our children out of poverty. People are going to start seeing these child tax refunds hit their bank accounts this month. And the American Families Plan will make that permanent. So I'm a big supporter of the American Families Plan as well. The American Families Plan also has funding in there for universal preschool for ages 3 and 4. We know that study after study shows the most impact you can have on a human being's life is under the age of 5, because their brains are still developing. If you can make sure that they get the resources that they need, these little kids, then it will affect them for the rest of their lives. And this is how we have America compete in the 21st century, by having funding for education for 3 and 4-year-olds all the way, not only through high school, but also expanding it to the first 2 years of community college as well.
Why do you think it is that the Republicans kind of reflexively seem to push against the very kind of family values that, when it comes to the evangelical church and so forth and so on, keep getting preached from the pulpit? But when it comes to legislatively actually trying to do something like access to contraception and making that free for people, or healthcare being free, or these other things, that there's always this pushback that labels these things as either socialist or whatever it may be. I just don't get that level of hypocrisy and how they can get away with this. What are your thoughts on that?
You're asking me to think like a Republican, and I don't quite know how to do that. What you point out is something I've noticed over time. So, for example, Republicans like to talk about defunding the police. When you look at actual votes, every Republican voted no on the American Rescue Plan. I serve in local government. Most of police funding comes from local government. The American Rescue Plan had significant funding for local government. So in terms of actions, it was actually Republicans voting no on funding the police. It was Democrats voting, in fact, to fund local government, which we knew would fund the police. So you do see this dichotomy where Republicans will say one thing and then vote completely another way.
Yeah, and I think, I've been thinking about this for a long time. The last 5 years, I've been working on a project that'll come out this November as a book. So I'm not pushing it now as a book because it's not even for sale. But I've got a book. I mean, talk about an obvious in-your-face title: Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy. And it's not a book about a return to traditional quote unquote morality, but these are the things that it seems to me that a democratic legislative agenda is really about. It gives room for people to fall in love. It gives room to have children. It gives room to stay put, say near family. It gives priority to saving the planet. And this is actually the way to happiness rather than greed and the accumulation of wealth, possessions, and so forth. So, when this book comes out, obviously I'm going to get you and other friends that I have a copy. But one thing I think that we need to do is translate this talk of morality on the right into a legislative challenge from a progressive point of view, saying, okay, before we revisit Roe v. Wade, what are we actually going to do to give choices to people to, for instance, stay at home and do some childcare? One example, I'm getting Social Security now, thank God for the US government, and so is my wife, and we do childcare for 3 of our 5 grandchildren. As a result, we couldn't afford it otherwise. I'm a writer, not a billionaire. But it seems to me that if a person stays home and gives childcare, we might want to reconsider some funding on a Social Security basis for people who have been homemakers, and that should count as valuable work rather than just a professional career outside the home. How can we get there? How can we make this a real topic, do you think?
So the child tax credit is a step in that direction. We're basically giving tax refunds to families who have children. And we also have to look at elder care, for example, which is the flip side of this. Yeah. We have more and more older Americans who need care, and elder care is something that also has funding in what's called the American Jobs Plan. So if you look at what the Biden-Harris administration is doing, they're really focusing on the American family, on senior citizens, and on young children. I think that's exactly what we need to do in order to move America forward, and also to really get a lot of the voters to understand that government can do good and wonderful things for you, and we're here to help.
What do you think about this idea of a kind of a post-pandemic blueprint, legislatively, but even more importantly, socially? Because as you know, and I know, it isn't just what the law says, it's, to put it in the vernacular, it's what's cool to do. And until, for instance, the role of parent, whether it's a gay parenting couple or a single person or a pair bonded traditional couple, whatever it may be, until those roles are reversible and it just becomes a male thing to be a nurturer as much as a female thing, how do we get to the point where you can swap nurturing home care roles, where somebody can stay home with a child, say before they're 4 years old, do those years with them with some sort of support from the culture, and that would not only be totally acceptable, but it would be unthinkable as a form of discrimination that they suffer when they go back to work, whether it's male, female, non-binary isn't the point. That this idea that career is serious, we got to have, jobs come first, family, love, connection, community, care, nurturing is always secondary, to the point where I have female friends, for instance, who tell me they're in business, they're in high positions, that they routinely lie about where they are, say when they take a call, pretend they're in an office when maybe they're doing a school pickup. And I know dads that do the same thing, and gay parents who do the same thing. How did we get to the place where it's not cool or fashionable to put family and connection first? And it's always jobs, 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 the GDP. From a moral point of view, I'm not asking you as a political figure, but just from the point of view of a family man, how do we change this?
Well, one way to do it is to have longer paid parental leave. Many other civilized countries have much longer paid parental leave than the US does. And that would send a signal to all Americans that parenting is viewed as really important by society and by our government and our nation. Also have the effect, again, of helping kids who are under the age of 5. And again, studies show that if you can nurture them, provide them lots of sensory input, that will affect their brain development and help them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it would seem to me, one way to sum that up would be that we would adjust our society, education, family life, and political and economic lives to comply with the most basic evolutionary prime directive of all, which is the survival of the friendliest. the new science on this subject that I've been researching for my book, that's been going now for 20 years. I don't mean my book, but the science. You know, it used to always be the survival of the fittest and a kind of a brutalist view of society and life and winners and losers. And now all the new science is very much on the side of saying, look, the only reason we're still here is the idea of the survival of the friendliest and cooperation. What's weird to me is that fits in so well with the Christian evangelical ideas I was raised on in an open home community back in the 60s and 70s. And now, you know, that kind of inclusion is branded either socialist or left wing or non-Christian. I don't know what. Now, speaking not as a political leader, but as a moral leader, because I think you are one, how do we address that we really start emphasizing this cooperative aspect of human existence rather than this competitive one?
That's a great point. I happen to like Matthew 25:35, and that's all about giving people food and drink and shelter. And it's right there in the Gospels. And
Yeah.
I think we need to focus on helping those who are in need. Again, the child tax credit is lifting half of our children out of poverty, but let's lift all of them out of poverty. And let's think about how we can help the American family move forward. And that's directly in line with a lot of Christian principles. And hopefully we can get more and more Christian evangelicals to take a look at these democratic policies, because they look like they fit right into what the Gospels are teaching.
Yeah, you know, one time I was talking, I think it was with Maxine Waters, and I had the privilege of visiting Nancy Pelosi at her home. And when we were there, there was a sort of a talk, we were having a talk, Speaker Pelosi puts on an event up there near her home that brings in people, thinkers, and so forth. And I was part of that. At that time, there was this idea of a demographic shift in the United States that was going to have voters outnumbering white conservative voters. People were coming in over the border and so forth and so on. But, you know, one thing I haven't heard Democratic leaders talk about, and I'm asking you if you have, that I think is very pertinent, again, coming from my evangelical background, is that when you look at the numbers of Hispanic voters and others who voted for Donald Trump in the last election, it seems to me the Democratic Party had misunderstood something a long time ago. And that is that unless you speak in more than the language of numbers and economics, but also address, for instance, Hispanic, Pentecostal, Protestant Christians, or conservative Roman Catholics in moral terms, then some evangelical pastor who's a white nationalist, who doesn't even like brown people, to be frank, and probably is a racist as well, can reach out with the language of describing Democrats as immoral. They're all about forcing gay teachers into schools or abortion, you name it, all this stuff. Why doesn't the Democratic Party do a better job in reaching out in moral terms, religious terms, Matthew 25, whatever it is, and saying, hey, look, our whole program reflects what you and we believe in. Don't let these white Republican hypocrites lie to you and fold you into their system. They are not on your side. What do you think about that?
One reason that I was excited about Vote Common Good and really wanted to have a lot more people get involved along exactly the lines you just said is I think it's bad for one political party, Democrats, to not talk about religion. I think we simply have to talk about it more. There are a lot of very religious Democrats, and for whatever reason within the party, people tend not to talk about faith and religious issues. I think that's a mistake. I think we should talk about that more. I know that sometimes when I talk to people, I tell them that to me, the best thing that happened to me in 2015 wasn't that I first got elected to Congress. It was that I got our two kids baptized. And so I think if people can just talk about their own personal faith journeys, that would resonate with constituents. I think Vote Common Good has done a great job trying to take that space and talk about religion, and also teach people how to talk about religion in a respectful, sensitive way. But I do agree with you. I think the Democratic Party has to talk a lot more about faith. One reason is because most Americans are religious. Most Americans also don't pay attention to politics. And they may pay way more attention to what's happening in their local communities and at their churches. And I think that's something Democrats have to do a far better job at in reaching out to people where they are.
Yeah, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that the fault not only lies with Democrats who haven't reached out enough and have been embarrassed. I mean, it's kind of like the old flag thing, people hanging flags outside their house. And for a while, the right wing had all of this in the Reagan era that I remember. And then, people on the progressive side woke up to the fact, hey, we can't let them take the flag and as if they own it. The same with patriotism and all these other issues. But, I've had a lot to do with the media over the years as a writer. And it seems that the prestige media in this country really fell down. I'm very critical of folks at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the networks, and so forth. Back in the day when there was a kind of hegemony of the news, they have a style section. They have a science section. Except for Newsweek that stopped doing this about 30 years ago, there's no religion section. And so all of a sudden, when the religious right arrives, it's like, well, who are these people? We don't know anybody like that. It's a big surprise. Whereas, let's say, back in the day when my father, Francis Schaeffer's books, like A Christian Manifesto, were selling 1 million copies and outselling anything on the New York Times list at that time, because they weren't reviewing religious books, somehow not taking it seriously. A lot of left-wing people and progressives were blindsided when a whole generation of evangelicals tutored in a theology of rebellion against the government, as if everything bad comes from Washington, suddenly emerge. It's like, well, who are these people? Well, when they stormed Congress in January 6th, and a lot of them doing it in the name of Jesus, it's like, what's going on here? If there'd been a religion section actually informing Americans as to what's going on in the evangelical community for the last 40 years, it would not have been a surprise. And I know that's a long little sermon, but I just would like your reaction to it, because it's a real bee in my bonnet.
I think you make a great point. I think you're absolutely right that the mainstream media does tend to focus on certain topics and not others. I can tell you that when you look back, I think history will find it bizarre that the mainstream media focused so much on Hillary Clinton's emails. That just wasn't a major issue for any reason whatsoever. And somehow the mainstream media blew that up. At the same time, they do ignore these other topics like you just mentioned. And you're right. I don't read a lot of articles about what's happening in religious life in America. And I think it would be a good idea if mainstream media had religious sections. I completely agree with you on that.
Well, and that those arguments could be answered. For instance, my dad, in his book, A Christian Manifesto, which came out in the mid-'80s, said that if Roe v. Wade wasn't reversed using democratic means, it would be legitimate to do whatever was needed to change that, up into including whatever would have been legitimate to overthrow Adolf Hitler. So then all of a sudden, the Congress is being stormed 40 years later, and they're waving flags and doing this in the name of Jesus and want to hang Mike Pence. Everybody's saying, gee, what happened here? If they had been tracking with the radicalization of the right for 40 years, none of this would have been a surprise. It was not a surprise to me. I was predicting exactly what was going to happen. I don't mean the storming of the Congress, but violent acts, militias, all these other things. And I don't understand why, A, the media doesn't do more on this, and B, we don't hear more challenges coming from the Democratic Party that say, look, this is un-American, it's outside of the democratic tradition, and really informing people as to where this is going, which is not in a democratic direction. I don't mean Democratic Party, I mean democracy.
So we do now have a select committee that's been established that will look at what led up to January 6th, what happened on January 6th, and the consequences of January 6th, so it never happens again. And hopefully that committee will also look at some of the issues you raised as how did religion play a part in some of the insurrectionist thinking?
Yeah, and I really would urge, you in terms of helping shape policy, to not let people weasel out of this just because it's uncomfortable. Because if we keep pretending that it's all poverty in Appalachia or the Rust Belt or angry white males without college education, sure, some of that contributes. But just like the election of Donald Trump, you can take Vladimir Putin out, you can take the disinformation out, you can take Facebook out, but if you take the evangelical voter out, he's not president. That's his base. And when he sat down with Ralph Reed and people like Franklin Graham, and they cut deals with him saying, look, if you appoint Federalist Society judges, and if you do this, this, and this, we will give you the ground game you're missing, because Hillary has a better ground game than you. We will give you that ground game. It's called churches and crisis pregnancy centers, and traded for the agenda. This all really happened. This is not like me thinking something like that might have happened. This did happen. You know, the Democratic Party here really has to address the issue of radicalized religion in this country much more forthrightly than it has been doing, I think, or we're just not addressing the real problem.
I would agree with you. At the same time, as Vote Common Good showed, there are a number of evangelical voters that were completely offended by the former president.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about all individuals, but as a movement, thank God that these exceptions, and, you know, Vote Common Good, our idea was that, you know, if we could peel away 2-3% of the vote, he wouldn't be president. And we would be able to flip Congress and so forth. And I hope that's still true, because those margins are so narrow. But nevertheless, I just think again, and then I'll get off this point, and that is the secular big time media, secular from an evangelical point of view, and the movers and shakers in the Democratic Party tend to see things more in economic and legislative terms, don't talk enough about religion, and ordinary progressive voters are caught unawares again and again and again about how angry and radical this group seem to be, and to the lengths they will go. And you combine that with a highly armed country with all these militias running around, and the chances of something really bad happening are pretty high, I think.
I don't disagree with you, and I take your point. I do think we absolutely have to look at the radicalization of folks, both within the Republican Party, but also, as you mentioned, in some of these sort of militias, and then to see how the religious component plays into that.
Yeah, one question I have for you is, when it comes to these issues of family that I think are so key to our future, how do you see a legislative agenda now evolving in the Biden years that is possible with this divided Senate and the narrow margins we have, and people are already starting to think about the next election in terms of what voter suppression will do? How much more of Biden's agenda do you think will be realized when it comes to impact on real family values, choices for work for women, for people staying home to work more, for instance, and not having to go back to the office, to this kind of stuff, where people really live out their lives in trying to balance this work and life agenda?
So the American Rescue Plan was a pretty big deal.
Right.
In addition to child tax refunds, we also had investments in there for additional health care, and we had a lot of programs for job creation. So there's now been over 3 million jobs created since Joe Biden became president. There's two other components that the Biden-Harris administration put out. We've got the American Jobs Plan to replace the millions of jobs that were lost during the pandemic, and then American Families Plan, which is very focused on the American family. The American Rescue Plan passed through something called budget reconciliation, which you only need a majority vote in the Senate. We can basically do that one more time under these arcane and bizarre Senate rules. So I do think we're going to get another very significant law passed one more time through budget reconciliation. And I think that will also be very focused on the American family and on creating jobs. So I'm very excited to see what's going to happen in the next few months. So even though we have a divided Senate, Democrats do control, I do think we can get something significant done through budget reconciliation.
Why do you think that President Biden seems, to me anyway, to get so little credit for the radical, in the good sense of the word, of transformative agenda he's managed to achieve? You know, I've been around for a while. I'm pushing 70 now, and I've known political people all my life. Unfortunately, most of them on the right, before I changed and met some folks like you and Nancy Pelosi. But that said, in my living memory, you know, we talk about Trump. There's nobody like Trump in living memory. Forget Trump. In my living memory, there has never been as transformative a president as President Joe Biden. And I am a big fan of his. And I came to the table a little reluctantly because I'm an Elizabeth Warren backer, and I voted for her here in my own state. President Biden has really surprised me. I am, my hat is off to him. I have tremendous respect. And I don't know why it is that we're not just sort of ringing all the bells and saying, we've never seen anything this transformative and so dramatically done. Am I overestimating what he's doing?
You make a good point. I think part of it is his demeanor.
Yeah.
He comes across as a very reasonable, low-key person. And I think Andrew Yang said something fascinating when he said that the magic of Joe Biden is that whatever he says becomes the next, reasonable and the next moderate.
Yeah.
And so he has this way about him where he just tells you and the American people the way things are and what he wants to do to fix them. And it just sounds perfectly reasonable coming from him. And then when you look at the actual legislation, it is transformative. And
yes.
The good thing is the American people support this. And it's not just Democrats, it's Democrats and Republicans and independents. Yes. For example, the American Rescue Plan had essentially 60% support among Republican voters. That's pretty astounding. So I think President Biden is doing a fantastic job. And really, I think his demeanor is very good for this country right now. We need healing, we need unity, and he's almost exactly the opposite of the former president.
Yeah, and by the way, and I don't mean to be sycophantic here, but I find your demeanor and the way you operate, telling the truth with your tweets on one hand, but on the other hand, just the way you come across, for instance, now and in every appearance I see you in, as also very reassuring. It's a wonderful demeanor. This is a good bedside manner. If you want to change practices and become a doctor, I will become your patient. But, my feeling is that we are very lucky right now to have President Biden. We're lucky to have you, Speaker Pelosi, and others. I wonder if you ever feel a little discomforted with the sort of margins in the Democratic Party that maybe, talk about things like defunding the police, other stuff that has become Fox News, regurgitated endlessly, trying to distract from the fact that Republicans really do support Biden's agenda. How do you see all that playing out?
The Democratic Party is a big tent party, and the way the news media is configured, they have to make a profit, right? So, for example, we don't read about planes that land.
Right.
It's not interesting. And what ends up happening is the media focuses on conflicts. And what they'll do is they'll look at extreme statements and then try to blow that up. And unfortunately, it gives a skewed view of what's happening in Congress. If you actually look at the legislation that hits the House floor,
yes,
all of it is perfectly sensible, reasonable legislation that's going to move America forward and American families.
Yeah.
You're not going to see a defund the police bill on the House floor. You're not going to see any of the crazy stuff that Fox talks about on the House floor. So there's sort of this discrepancy between what you see in news media and what actually is voted on. And everything that's voted on is moving the American family forward.
Yeah, to change the subject radically for a while, I know you served in the military, did you not? I remember you and I talked.
I did. Yeah, active duty in the 1990s.
Yeah, and you're one of the few in Congress that has, by the way. My son volunteered for the Marine Corps right out of high school. And was in Afghanistan twice at the beginning of that war, and then once in Iraq. One of the reasons he came home alive is because of the Afghanis who helped our people. In fact, he became a very good friend of one of his interpreters and would go to his home in Kabul with him between missions. Another time, my son would volunteer with another Afghani to guard a girls' school on his own time as a Marine, to protect them from retribution against people who did not want girls to have educations. So my heart sort of breaks when I think about the fact that we're moving so slowly to bring some of the Afghans over here who helped us. And I just can't believe that there's red tape in processing their visas. I don't get this. My son came home alive from 2 combat tours in Afghanistan because these folks didn't stab him in the back. They did work with him. And this is very personal to me. What can be done to speed up this process so we don't have a situation where, as in Vietnam, so many people feel betrayed who work with the US? So it's whatever you think of the war, pacifist, militarist, whatever, it just seems to me, if somebody stands up and works with you, you owe them something.
That's an excellent point. I've been working with vote vets, and we've been trying to raise this issue, and we've been talking to their Biden and Harris administration, and they completely get it. So they're working very hard to bring to the United States the Afghani people that helped the U.S. military. Not only is it the moral thing to do, it's also something that's good for our national security, because if we don't do this, then in the future, when we're in a future conflict in a foreign country, much less likely they're going to want to help us if they see that we're just going to abandon them when we leave. So the administration is working very hard to bring all their Afghani folks who did help the U.S. military into the United States. And I do think that we are going to be able to do that. The administration is on it. They understand the urgency. And as you point out, it's something we have to do absolutely for both moral reasons as well as to send a signal that this is what the U.S. is all about, and you can help us in the future, and we'll help you.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because it's just one of those things that really hurts me when I think about it. You know, when I prayed for my son to come back safe, one reason he did is because of the faithfulness of some of those folks. And then he went on to the University of Chicago and did very well. And now I'm taking care of 3 of his little children every afternoon. And he's working from home, by the way, because after COVID, he hasn't gone back into the office yet. But this is really personal to me. And I know to you, as someone who served in the U.S. military, it would be personal to you too.
Absolutely. And by the way, thank you to your son for his service.
Yeah. Well, hey, I mean, yeah, as a military parent, I can tell you, everybody who sort of sweats through those nights when your kid's off somewhere getting shot at, it's a long road, as you know. And there's too few people in this country, which sort of brings up this idea of national service. Are you I don't know your position on this, and so this isn't a loaded question, but what do you think about the idea of some form of national service for folks, so that it isn't only the few who volunteer that get out there and do something?
I support national service, and I think it's something that the government can implement, and we can get funding for it. It is also a matter of priorities, because of the 3 big bills, the American Rescue Plan, which is now law, as well as the American Families Plan, American Jobs Plan. I think we're trying to focus on those 3 things, and then we can look at the other issues. But I do support national service. And
do you think that with all the focus on the post-COVID rejuvenation of this country, that what we were talking about a moment ago, that some of these Afghani folks and their families are going to get lost in the shuffle? The Taliban have a nasty way of having public executions, and I can just imagine how that's going to roll worldwide. Here's what happens to you when you help America. We just lined up a family and shot them. And you know, I see that on the horizon unless this country really pulls together on this one, left, right, middle. How's the Republican bipartisan support for getting these people who stood with us back here if they want to come?
So it's certainly possible that Taliban might do what you say, and certainly they are very bad people. Yes. At the same time, I think they are eager for the United States to leave. I don't think they want to cause a really huge backlash that in their minds might keep the U.S. there for longer than they think we're going to be there. So I think what they're going to want is for us to leave, and they might sort of hold their fire for now while we're doing that. But in the meantime, we do have to bring all these Afghan interpreters and others who help the U.S. military back in the United States. At the end of the day, you know, we were in Afghanistan for over 20 years.
Yes.
Our military is amazing, the best in the world, but we're not designed to prop up governments. We're not designed to run countries. And it's really going to be the Afghan people who have to figure out how to fix their country and fix their problems. We just can't do it for them.
In terms of reaction to terrorism, which is what got us into Afghanistan and purportedly to Iraq under bogus circumstances, I think, with Bush, it seems to me that the next wave of terrorism is cyber terror. And we just have this huge attack again now with 800 to 1,000 companies attacked. And this comes on the heels. President Biden's been talking about getting tough on this. Practically, from your point of view of national security and looking at cyber terror as terror, how do we hit back at a country like Russia that's nuclear armed and we're never going to go to war with, and they know that, and get their attention on these issues so that we don't have people paying all this ransomware stuff? I mean, if this is the future, how can any of us function if our country isn't defended against this terror? What is being done on that front?
I'm a recovering computer science major, and I can speak on this topic for hours because there's so many different layers. One of them is we simply don't have enough cybersecurity professionals. So I actually have legislation called the New Collar Jobs Act that provides incentives for companies to send their folks into the cybersecurity professional field. We just need more of these professionals in both the public and private sector. At the same time, you mentioned Russia. It is a very nuanced and complex issue. Clearly, sometimes you have the Russian government doing these hacks, and you have at the same time criminal enterprises within Russia that are doing these hacks. And it's not clear that Russia is supporting these criminal enterprises. Maybe they're condoning them, maybe they're not. So it's very complicated. It's very hard to know in a lot of these ransomware attacks who's actually initiating it and whether it has state sanction behind them. So I know that our intelligence agencies are trying to figure and sort all of this out. We do clearly need to have Russia do more to crack down on these criminal enterprises if in fact they're not supporting them. Because when you're Vladimir Putin, you do have a lot of power in Russia, and you can ratchet your power to try to reduce the number of ransomware attacks originating from Russia in the United States.
Yeah, we have a question from one of the people watching saying a lot of Americans want to get involved and engage our leadership, but may not know exactly the best way to do so. What is the best way to let our representatives know that we support legislation like the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan?
I think Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. So I want everyone watching to understand your power to help shape public sentiment. Social media is free. So if you write an interesting post, maybe you'll affect a voter in Florida or in Ohio or in Oregon. Think about writing letters to the editor. It's true that many people do write letters to the editor. It's also true many of them come from the same people. So when you start writing in, you'll eventually get published and you can change hearts and minds. And then you can lobby your local, state, and federal representatives. We all have phone numbers, emails. And here's something I wanted to share. So I'm in these 2-year legislative cycles in Congress. And in these 2-year cycles, I'm going to vote over 1,000 times. I can tell you in about 80 to 90% of those votes, I don't get a single phone call, email, fax, or meeting. So when you start calling in or writing in, then you'll get either my staff or me to take notice and wonder, hey, why are folks writing in on this particular issue? So don't underestimate your power to help shape public sentiment.
That's a really good point. You know, I'd never heard anyone say that before. And of course, that would be the same in any person's office in Congress, wouldn't it? You know, with all those votes and you're never hearing from anyone.
That is correct. Many votes, we hear nothing. That is correct.
That's amazing. I never would have figured that's the case. So before we wrap this up, I have a kind of a last question for you on a personal note. How do you see the trajectory of your own life now as we come out of the COVID period, balancing your own family and work? How's that, for a start, just how's that working out? Because you must be pressed to the limit at this point.
Well, thank you for asking. My family is doing very well. And the most important thing we have to do is keep people safe and get our economy back on track.
Yeah,
I do think that with the effectiveness of these vaccines, we're going to get to normal much sooner rather than later. And for anyone who hasn't gotten vaccinated yet, I do encourage you to go talk to your doctor and have your doctor explain the benefits and the risks, and then you can make a decision. But what we do know from study after study is that these vaccines are tremendously effective, not just against traditional COVID, but also against the Delta variant.
How did it happen that Fox News and some of their commentators and other people seem to be spreading so many anti-vax rumors? What is wrong with the American right wing? I mean, you would think this is something we could agree on, that this is a place that science can do something for us. What on earth is going on? And why is there the weird symbiosis between Trump followers, Fox News, a big segment of the white evangelical population, and anti-vax mythology? It's a real mystery to me. I just don't get why these predictable things keep happening. Whereas if it's going to really be kind of anti-science and short-sighted, it's almost predictable where it's going to come from. I mean, when does this end and how does it end?
That's an excellent question. Well, as you know, the Bible basically says, do not put the Lord your God to the test.
Yeah.
And every time I see a lot of unvaccinated people go indoors, for example, for a church gathering, they're putting God to the test. And they're essentially, ignoring science, ignoring what we know about how COVID is transmitted. And people, unfortunately, have died.
Yes.
Especially early on when you had, these choirs, because of the way COVID transmitted, choirs were particularly bad at in terms of the huge rate which it can transmit the virus. So I don't really understand why people are so hesitant to take the vaccine, especially now that they can see a lot of people have taken the vaccine, and it's been very helpful to protect people from getting COVID. I don't understand either why you seem to have a partisan split, because the former president, in fact, got vaccinated, as well as did the former first lady. And the former president pushed very hard on Operation Warp Speed and wanted to take a lot of credit for getting these vaccines out. So you would think that the former president's supporters would get vaccinated. So I completely don't understand why there's so much vaccine hesitancy among the former president's supporters. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, maybe it's because there's a whole lot of his supporters that were raised in a religious milieu, which sort of sees yourself as a victim of science, and that, hey, they may teach you this in high school about evolution, but here's what the Bible says. From your mother's knee, if you're always given an alternative view of the universe, as if somehow you're the beleaguered minority and you've got to hang on to your truths grimly in the face of all the evidence, that it's pretty easy to get into that. And I think there's a connection there. I don't know what you think about that.
That's interesting. That's possible. The only other thought I had is the former president's supporters, I think, might have viewed COVID as what took down the former president. So anything associated with that, they don't want to have anything to do with. They want to shy from. They want to downplay it. So that's the only other thought I have. But again, the former president got vaccinated himself, and he promoted these vaccines. So it's just a very odd thing that I'm watching. I don't.
Yeah, and another odd thing, it seems to me, is that we hear that gun sales and ammunition sales skyrocketed as people felt unsafe during the COVID epidemic. Why that is the case, I don't know. But aren't getting that same cohort don't get vaccines. You're a lot more likely to die of COVID if you're an overweight white male my age with a household full of guns and ammunition, but no vaccine. You're a lot more danger than if you're a gun short of a load. It just seems crazy to me. There's a form of insanity in the air today, Representative, that I don't understand.
And it's not even just dying from COVID. If you get a severe case of COVID, you could have lasting effects, such as loss of taste or loss of smell. There's been neurological difficulties identifying people that have had COVID, as well as other long-term health problems. And so this is not a disease you want to get.
Yeah. So on that cheerful note, I want to thank you for taking the time in conversation with me. Representative Ted Lieu of California's 33rd District. I am a huge fan of yours. I bless your name. I'm always love to see anything you do pop up anywhere. This was fantastic, and I hope that everyone listening will share this far and wide. And thank you, Congressman. And please, anyone watching, share this, tell folks about it. It'll be up on my podcast. And thank you for being here today. Really, 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 I do. Should you ever decide to run for an office in a part of the country where I can vote for you, like say a national office, we won't name which, I will drop everything. I'm pushing 70, just do it before I'm 80. And I'll give you the whole span of your campaign to work for you and volunteer for you.
Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you for having me on your show.
It's really great. Thank you, and blessings and safety.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.